Mr. Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member, kind of curious order we're going in this morning, but I have more questions than I have time. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I want to get into some specifics as it relates to California's water issue. I find it somewhat saddening that some of our colleagues here in the committee continue to think that growing food is of less importance, and using farmers and farm workers as political football is and kicking them in the teeth is somehow appropriate. But nonetheless, I will continue to try to solve and fix some of the broken water problems we have in California. To that end, we had a bipartisan piece of legislation that you're familiar with, the WIN Act, that was passed. It's got a 5-year window in terms of its implementation. The idea being simply to use greater flexibility when we have water moving through the system without violating existing environmental law, to move more water through the system for the state. Under current rainfall in California, can you speak to the specifics of how Reclamation intends to implement the flexibility provided in this act?
Well, we have put additional funds in the WIN Act, and I've always found it actually somewhat ironic because they always talk about the rich Republican farmers, but they're being represented by a poor Democrat legislator. Thank you. But yeah, water's a serious issue.
It's the farmers and the farm workers and the communities that put food on America's dinner table every night.
Absolutely, and quite frankly, much of the debate in the central issue is internal between California. I've always found it as the federal water, sometimes referee. I'm refereeing water that begins in California, ends in California, is used in California. And there's never a scenario where the federal government's going to win in this.
So is your notion, or the conversation we had previously about returning federal projects within a watershed totally within a state to return those to states?
I have talked to the governor about it, and we're willing to discuss it. I understand when you have basins and they go multiple state, why a federal government needs to be the fair referee.
Well, as I told you, that's not a new idea, and it has merit, but it also has a lot of controversy, like everything else in California.
I'm not sure it's more controversial than what I deal with every day.
Interior's budget, does it provide enough resources to implement real-time monitoring of fish populations so that now we've been getting water this week, that we can pump more water when endangered species are not present?
I think it provides an adequate amount. You know, some of it is, again, the way we're organized between the different bureaus.
Right, and we talked about that. And would you support legislation to put those purposes of NOAA and NIMS from Commerce into the Department of Interior? And by the way, how well are you working with Commerce and NOAA and NIMS?
We work with them well. You know, I'm on the record, and I haven't changed since I was a congressman. I've always looked at Interior, the Forest Service, NIMS. We need to either work together more closely and make a structural change to do that. And So
you would consider supporting legislation that would make it more logical? We know the political reasons on how this evolved some 40 years ago.
I would. I can tell you the headwinds, a lot of it are over in the Senate. And it has nothing to do with
been dealing with this
what's right. It's who's in what's committee.
Both in Sacramento and now here in Washington. Let me segue over. I mean, I'll submit some questions and you can respond to it for the record. But finally, a lot of us were concerned with the proposed increased fees to cover the way overdue, and you mentioned it, maintenance efforts for our national parks. And, you know, while I don't represent Yosemite or Kings Canyon, they're in my backyard, and I feel like it's a part of our area. Those increases, I think, are very harmful to people who want to have access to the parks. I think we ought to find a better way to put the money up front to deal with this deferred maintenance for all of our national parks, but obviously I'm focused on Yosemite and Kings Canyon, which I've known you visited.
Well, and the proposals that are oftentimes in the news were just that. There were a series of proposals. We haven't made a decision yet. When we get to a draft, no doubt the chairman, the ranking member on both both House and
And
Senate.
these
are gonna
belong to
stand.
all Americans, and we want to make sure they're accessible and affordable.
And I agree. I think the best value in America still is the year pass,
Perhaps,
$80.
perhaps America's greatest idea, as
Greatest idea. I'm not sure who pays for the parks, by the way. Everyone goes in for free.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Chairman.